All right, good morning, LifePoint. All right, well done. Good. Thank you, guys. Sometimes first service, they're a little still waking up. You say good morning. No, so I appreciate that. I'm Brett. I'm one of the pastors here. I just want to say welcome. We're glad that you're here. Now that summer has come, I don't know about you guys, but our kids, we're doing the best we can to keep them out of the house a little bit, right? Keep them out playing. You can see some of the bronzing or if you're like some of my daughters, just kind of get beat red for a couple of days. Kind of keep the kids busy and occupied outside as much as we can. We have a big backyard, so they love to swing and a little rope that they climb and all these good things. But eventually outside, they have to start using their imagination, right? Try to devise new games or think of new things to do. And they love to do two things in particular. They love to play family, and so they're always coming, Daddy, you be daddy and I'll be mommy. Or you be daddy and I'll be sister. I'll be dad. They also love to play doctor. And so they'll go around the yard and they'll find just little leaves, and they'll put it on me, say, Daddy, you had an owie. You need a Band-Aid. Let me put that on you. They'll try to take care of me. They'll grab a stick that they find, and it's a splint. Actually, one of our daughters, she's better now, but she recently broke her arm, and so everything in the yard became like a cast. Daddy, come and get your cast. Let me put that on you, And I couldn't help but think how sweet these girls really are. That's really sweet, because me, when I was a kid, not so much. Right, this was never a cast. Come on, clearly this is a sword or maybe a gun. But I mean, as a little boy, I had this tendency. I could turn anything that you gave me into a sword, or get a little stick and you got a gun here. And we had games. We would play in the Stanley's backyard, hide behind trees and kind of just. But we had like an honor code where even though it didn't shoot anything, you knew you had to say if you got hit, if you got surprised, or we'd get these little acorn type things, and they kind of be our bullets, And if you found a bigger one. Get ready, boys. You got a bigger one. I mean, this is a grenade. That thing that'll clear the whole row. So we had these games where we would take these things and make them into destructive things, right? Or as a kid, though, someone give me a gift, and I'd find a way to use it in a way for which it was not intended, to make it a catapult, make it a slingshot, make it into something that could break or destroy something. I don't know if it was a boy thing. I don't know if it was a neighborhood thing, but that's just kind of the way we did. There was a time that any good gift or any beautiful thing in nature, I could somehow turn it with my destructive tendencies, just kind of grind it down to dust. And the truth is, I think a lot of us, we've seen this on a broader scale. We see this in the world around us, the same kind of destructive tendency, this tendency to turn sticks into swords. As you think about the wars that have been fought over beauty, over love. Helen of Troy, famously, they say she's had the face that launched 1,000 ships. The irony of maiming and killing in the name of capturing and pursuing this beauty. Not just irony, but sad. Or you think about people's pursuit of truth, and people, I won't just name politicians, but politicians, including other people, have been known to lie and deceive in the name of preserving some truth they believed in, some what they believed to be a higher principle. Sometimes we do shameful things in order to maintain and establish the honor of our families. I think there's a real truth even that in church, in your spiritual lives, there's a way that we take good gifts from God, good and beautiful gifts that God gives us, and we use them in ways to divide. We use them in ways to hurt others, to lift ourselves up or put someone else down. We turn those good gifts into swords that make us feel better, but really aren't the heart of what God has given us these gifts to be about. Jesus came as king. This is what Mark wants us to get as we read Mark's gospel. He is the King of heaven, come down to earth, and he's here to show us a better way. We're continuing our series, When Love Comes to Town. Join me in the book of Mark, chapter 2, verse 23, or page 838 if you grabbed one of the pew Bibles. If you have your own Bible, Mark 2, encourage you to open up with me. As always, I always love to see when you guys bring your own Bibles, take notes in it or underline, and that's a great resource for you later as maybe you're looking back through the Gospel of Mark or looking back through another book that we studied together months or even years down the road. Those notes could be an encouragement to you. So I encourage you to do that or follow along on the screen behind. Mark, it has a gospel account, we say. It's an account of Jesus' life, a biography of Jesus' life and ministry. And as I just said, Mark is interested in this idea that Jesus is king, the king of heaven come down to earth to set things right, to undo the power of death and destruction, to breathe life back into God's creation, to breathe spiritual life into you and I. Sometimes when love comes to town, that can sound so cuddly, so soft, so easy, but the truth is sometimes when love comes to town, we can kind of get on our face a little bit, step on our toes, because there are times where Jesus has to tell us, hey, the systems that you have, the things that you're doing, the thoughts that you have even sometimes, they're destructive. They're not right. They're healthy. They're not healthy. And so Jesus here, we find him giving us a case study with one of these good gifts that we've turned into something destructive. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he, Jesus, said to these Pharisees, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat. And also he gave it to those who were with him. And Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, you heard this word quite a few times in there, Sabbath. It's a foreign sounding word. And many of us maybe haven't heard it before. Maybe if we have heard it before, we heard it, but we don't really understand what it means. Or maybe we think we understand what it means. But the truth is, none of us can really get our minds around the experience of what it was to keep Sabbath in its ancient Jewish context. For Jesus and the other Jews of his time, you see, Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest. Shabbat, they would call it. It's from sundown Friday evening to sundown Saturday evening. And it wasn't simply a day of rest. Of course, they did rest, but really, Sabbath is an act of trust, an act of worship, an act of saying, God, I'm going to trust in your way. Because when you followed Sabbath, it wasn't just a single day that you would devote to God. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Really, your whole week had to be devoted around preparing for the Sabbath. It was coming in and saying, God, I believe that 6 days your way is better than 7 days my way. God, I believe that you and what you teach about our rest and our trust in you, believing that you are God, and our worlds won't fall apart when we step away for a day. It was an act of worship, an act of trust. And the truth is, they had to prepare for it all week long. Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest, it was a lifestyle. And I mean that literally, because as soon as Sunday would come, the first day of the week, faithful Jews would begin to have to make plans and consider what they would do and how they would make themselves ready for Sabbath. They couldn't work and they shouldn't cook or even clean the home. They didn't travel on the Sabbath. And so it wasn't one of these things that you just kind of showed up to church and then went about the rest of your day. And when you practiced Sabbath, you had to prepare the rest of the week. Make sure I have the food that I need. Make sure that the house is clean. Make sure I can cook the food before that day. All the way back through the whole week, Sabbath reordered your entire week. Now, this is just a little reminder for me, a little glimpse of what that was like. Some of you know my family lived in Greece for 5 years. And in Greece, everything is closed by national law on Sundays. No grocery stores, no supermarkets, no places to go get clothes, no pharmacies. Everything's closed on Sunday. And for the first 6 months that we lived there, every Saturday night, every Sunday morning, every Sunday evening, we would remember something that we didn't have. Oh, I was supposed to pick up that pharmacy. I was supposed to pick up my prescription. We don't have any milk. It's Sunday morning. What do we do? We don't have any more diapers left. Brad, how do we get to Sunday morning? How do we get to Monday morning? And if you found yourself in that position, you were just out of luck. Or you maybe had to borrow from a neighbor or find some other shortcut. But the truth is, these stores just weren't open on Sundays. Now, it wasn't a Sabbath. People still traveled. People still cooked. They cleaned. They did their chores. But just a glimpse of the way that it had to reorder our lives. It took us 6 months to get used to it. It took us 6 months to begin to actually be able to plan ahead and say, it's Friday, I better start shopping since everything will be closed on Sunday. And Saturday, I better start to make sure I've got all my toiletries, all the diapers that we need, or the pharmaceuticals that we need. We want to make sure that we're prepped up. And in the ancient context, it was a little bit like that, but just to the complete next level. You couldn't even cook or clean on the Sabbath. And the time that it took to prepare food, you would prepare all week long. It was a lifestyle. It changed the way that you lived. And really, it set you apart as one who was following the way of God. One who was living life God's way, trusting God with that day. So we see in this context, as we think about preparing and the Sabbath, God commanded the Sabbath. Right? This idea was not new here to Jesus. This idea was not new to the book of Mark. This was an idea, if you're not familiar with the Bible, it goes way back into the Old Testament. Even is rooted in creation itself. God created the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a good thing in and of itself. The problem is not with the principle. The problem is with the practice. Right? Because suddenly the Sabbath became a sword in the hands of some religious people. It became a way of saying, you're not doing it right. It became a way of comparing one to another, my interpretation to your interpretation, my devotion to your devotion, my zealotry to your passion. And next thing you know, this good gift from God, this gift that was purposed to help us trust and depend on Him, it became an object of division. And so we find Jesus walking on the Sabbath with His disciples, and they begin to pick some grain on their way through. And the Pharisees, they use this as an opportunity to pounce. The Pharisees were these religious teachers in Jesus' day, and they had their own teaching about the Sabbath. They had their own laws, around the law, just so you wouldn't accidentally break God's law. And the Pharisees pounced. They said, who do you think that you are? God gave us this command. How can you pick grain? How can you do what's not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, I don't want you to miss this as we look at how Jesus responded. What He does here, it's easy for us in our context to just buzz by and miss what Jesus is doing here, but it's very, very bold. It's a very powerful thing that Jesus is about to do. He's amazed those who will listen to Him because He reminds these teachers, these religious teachers, about what David did. David was a leader in early Israel, the second king that Israel ever had, someone who'd been admired throughout the history of Israel. And Jesus tells them about the time that David goes and he eats this bread that was set apart for sacred purposes. It was only for the priest to eat. David eats it and he gives it to his friends when he's hungry. Now, Jesus' illustration here is not about just a hungry guy, not about a guy who just wanted some bread, but ultimately, the reason that David's actions are remembered and the reason that David's actions are condoned and accepted by the tradition of the Jews from that day forward is because David was a soon-to-be king. He was operating in his kingly authority. He said, I can do this. And so the people of Israel gave him a pass. The priests gave him a pass. History looked kindly on what David had done because he was a king. Jesus says there's one who is greater than David among you. He says, the Son of Man, this was one of Jesus' favorite nicknames for himself. The Son of Man is the Lord, is the Master. It has authority even over the Sabbath. Jesus here is giving us a revelation about his identity. He's saying, I am that king. You know how David was a king. I'm a greater king yet. I'm the king from heaven sent to earth to make right the brokenness that we see around us, to make right and breathe life back into God's creation. Jesus is king. And as king, he has authority over even the Sabbath. And that's going to be important here in a second. But as a reminder, when love comes to town, sometimes he stirs up a little trouble. Sometimes he steps a little too close for comfort. Sometimes love makes us put down our swords and start remembering why God had given us these gifts to begin with. When love comes to town, we put away our swords. And I don't need to tell you that these things like the Sabbath or maybe baptism, maybe communion, maybe Bible reading or prayer, these kind of practices or disciplines that we know in the spiritual life of the church. I don't need to tell you that they've turned into swords in the history of the church. Many of you have felt that burn, felt the sting of a Christian telling you how you were doing it wrong, a Christian telling you how it wasn't right, misusing God's good gifts, maybe misapplying God's law. And it breaks my heart. What really breaks my heart as a pastor as I read this and remember this is that far too easily it's still followers of Jesus today who can play the role of the Pharisee, who can play the role of the one who's looking down on everyone else from their spiritual high place, looking down and judging how everyone else is doing this, how everyone else is trying to follow God. And now, if you're not a Christian, if you're not, consider yourself a follower of Jesus here today, I don't need to tell you about this because you've probably experienced this. You probably experienced this from an overzealous Christian who told you how you were doing it wrong. Probably experienced it from someone who was turning God's good gift, God's grace to us into a sword. You've felt that before. As a pastor, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happens here in the context of the church so often. But the truth is, this is a warning for Christians here. If you're not a follower of Jesus, this word doesn't pertain to you this very moment. Just take a deep breath and you can relax. Because the truth is what Jesus is calling out here are the religious. People who are trying to live the life that God would call them to live. They're trying to please God, but somehow they've taken this good gift and they've turned it into a sword. They've taken, just like I took my stick and made it into a sword, they've taken the Sabbath and they've made it into a sword. They've taken this gift that God has given them for their good, for their rest, for their experience of His grace and His purposes and His way in their life. And they've used it as a way to divide, as a way to look down on other people. And Christians, we too often can do the same. We can take our practices today, maybe it's the Sabbath, or maybe it's baptism, maybe it's communion, maybe it's the way that we read our Bibles or our prayer lives. And so quickly start to look down on other Christians, so quickly can use it, what should be a gift of God in our life, the way that we experience God's grace, and we use it as a way to divide, to hurt, to bludgeon others. Jesus' words in verse 27 set the record straight. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This gift, the Sabbath is a gift that God has given to us to serve man, to serve us. As a way of experiencing God's way, as a way of growing in our trust of God, as a way of experiencing the rest that He has for us. It's a gift in the way that we know and grow and experience God. It's for our health and our benefit. But the truth is, with any of these spiritual practices, any of these spiritual disciplines, if we spend more time thinking about how everyone else is doing it wrong, we're doing it wrong. If I spend more time in communion, looking around and thinking about how other people's lives are more messed up than mine, I'm doing it wrong. If I'm thinking about anything else other than my union with Jesus and my identification with Jesus as we're being baptized or we're baptizing others, we're doing it wrong. If I approach my Bible reading and think about how I'm a better Christian than this person, or I read more than that person, I pray more, we're doing it wrong. And so Jesus, Mark here, as he tells us about Jesus' teaching, he stacks up two different Sabbath stories. So we don't miss the point. He wants us to see how Jesus interacts with this Sabbath so we don't do it wrong, so we don't miss the heart. Chapter 3, verse 1, another story of Jesus on the Sabbath. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm, to save or to kill on the Sabbath?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The Pharisees went out and immediately had counsel with the Herodians against Jesus at how they could destroy him. These gifts from God, these gifts that are given to us that we might experience and grow in his presence, that we might know his grace, these gifts of God so often are really, they become canvases upon which our own brokenness, our own insecurities, our own fear, our own sinfulness is displayed. When we use these gifts of God's grace as a way to control, as a way to hurt, as a way to divide. Here's the real danger. As we think about these gifts, as our attention and our eyes are focused on this gift, on this discipline, on this way to experience God, sometimes we can give so much attention to the gift that we miss the giver. And that's the very point that God wants to make sure is clear to us, is that these gifts aren't about the acts themselves. Prayer is not about prayer. Bible study is not about the Bible. Baptism is not about the water. Communion is not about the bread. They point us to Jesus. These gifts point us to the giver, that we would have a deeper and richer experience of him and have his grace and of his goodness in our lives. The Sabbath is not about rest. The Sabbath is about Jesus. All these gifts point us to the giver. And if our attention, if our heart is anywhere else, we're missing the point. Jesus shows us here in these big ideas that he alone, the big idea here in these verses, that he alone is the source of the rest in the Sabbath. He's the source of its healing. He's the source of God's presence in this great discipline in the history of Judaism. And today, I think many of us would benefit. We don't teach it as a law, certainly, the Sabbath, the way that the ancient Jews talked about the Sabbath, but so many of us would benefit by reordering our lives around God's way, about reordering our lives and thinking intentionally about our schedules to make sure that he was first. Not as a law, but as a spiritual discipline. But the truth is that the Sabbath is to help us set our eyes on Jesus. Communion is to help us set our eyes on Jesus. Baptism, whatever that spiritual discipline or practice is, all about helping us set up our eyes on Jesus. And as we get that big idea that he's the source of the rest that we seek, he's the source of the peace, he's the source of the grace that we seek, I don't want you to miss this radical thing that happens. Jesus is making such a radical claim here. And the people who were listening, they realized it. They knew what Jesus was saying was so outlandish, so radical, that verse 6 tips us off here. The Pharisees and the Herodians started working together to silence Jesus. Jesus is saying, I'm the one that you were made for. I bring you the rest and the peace that your heart longs for. And the Herodians, these are Jews who followed and supported Herod the Great. He was the Roman governor of the area. He was a Roman. He wasn't Roman in ethnicity, but an extension of Roman power. And this group of Jews said, yeah, we're going to be with him. We're going to support him. And the Pharisees, they made their name for themselves by supporting a different political faction, by being behind a whole different dynasty. These people are at polar opposite ends of Jewish political and religious thought. I mean, you think about the Republicans and the Democrats today, right? I don't know a single issue right now that they're going to work with each other on, right? It's just not happening. The Herodians and the Pharisees are like 10 times that, 100 times that. They were ferocious in their in their hate for each other. But one thing would bring them together. One thing would get them to work together. That's how radical Jesus' claims were. That's how bothered they were by Jesus. That one thing was to destroy Jesus, to silence him. Because the truth is that the Herodians and the Pharisees, they had this in common, that Jesus was a threat to their power. Jesus was a threat to their platform. Jesus was a threat to the people who were listening to him. And so they say, we got to get rid of this guy. We've got to silence him. We've got to destroy him. Because their own sense of self-assurance, their own rest, their own peace was found in their power. And I hope and I pray that we use this word today as an opportunity for us to check our hearts. Jesus said their hearts were hard. And so they couldn't hear the call of Jesus. They couldn't respond to the rest and the peace that was found in him because their hearts were hard. They were trying to find their peace in somewhere else. They were trying to find it in their power and their platform and their political position. And we would be foolish to miss this opportunity to check our own hearts. Where do we seek rest outside of God? Where do we seek rest outside of God's care and provision for us in Jesus? Some of us, it's career. Yeah, we work hard. We may not be restful in our career, but we work hard to make a name for ourselves. Some kind of legacy we can leave behind, or make a lot of money, and that will make us feel at peace. Finally, we can have some control in our lives. For some of us, we seek that sort of peace and fulfillment and rest in our career. For some of us, it's in the family. We try to find that perfect relationship. We try to make everything look just right, get the image just right. Right? It's almost like we get that one Instagram shot. The rest of our lives, 99% of it's chaos. But if we can just get that one where the kids look happy, and I look like a good father, and she looks like a good mother, we can project that image. We feel good about ourselves. Or maybe it's in getting away, right? Getting the right vacation. Then I'll feel good for the rest of the year. If we can get that great trip down to Cancun, if we can get that right vacation scheduled, that weekend getaway, if I can buy that lake house, or just get away and hunt in the woods for a few days, that will bring me back to balance. That'll bring me the restoration of my soul that I need. Or for some of us, maybe it's shopping, it's wine, it's doing whatever to kind of help us unwind. And the truth is that there's nothing innately bad about any of these things unless they become a substitute for the rest that Jesus gives us. If we're seeking to find the fulfillment and the purpose and the rest and the peace that only God can offer us in Jesus Christ, if we try to find those things in a lake home or in a great career and a lot of money, we're going to find ourselves empty. We're going to find ourselves back to turning everything into a sword because we got to find a way to feel better. We have to find a way to make ourselves a little bit higher than someone else. We have to find a way to show how we're right, someone else is wrong. And sometimes in our pursuit, we'll even take these good gifts that God gives us. We'll take baptism, we'll take communion, we'll take Bible reading, we'll take Sabbath rest, we'll take prayer. And instead of gifts of God in which we experience him and his presence, they become hurtful and destructive in ways we see ourselves better, ways in which we score theological points, ways that we put ourselves above someone else, rather than finding our peace in him. Jesus is the source of the rest that we look for in the Sabbath. Jesus is the source of the peace that our hearts long for, that we're made for. I think of a story. It's a fictional story, but I think a believable fictional story about an encounter in the first century from an early Christian with their Roman neighbor. Dick Lucas, a pastor, tells this story. He thought of this story of a young Christian woman moving into Rome, and her new Roman neighbor telling her, "Hey, I hear that you're religious. I'm so glad because our empire is founded on religion. It's the religious people that support the emperor. It's the religious people that support the empire." He goes, "Well, tell me, where do you go to temple? Where's your temple? Where's your holy place?" And this young Christian, she looks at him and she says, "Well, we don't have a temple. We don't have a sacred building or a sacred place because the truth is Jesus is our sacred place. Jesus is our temple. Jesus is where we go to meet God. And he goes, well, that's strange. A religion without a temple. Well, where do your priests work? Where do your priests go and make amends for you before God? Where do your priests go and mediate between you and God? What do the priests do if you don't have a temple? And she says, well, we don't have priests like that. We don't have someone that stands between us and God because Jesus is our priest. Jesus is the one that mediates between man and God. And this Roman neighbor just can't understand, doesn't have the terms and the categories to compute what in the world she's talking about. He says, a religion with no temple, a religion with no priest? Well, where is your sacrifice made? Where do they slaughter the animals to make peace and make amends and atonement for your sin? She says, well, we don't have sacrifices. We don't sacrifice animals in our religion. Jesus was the sacrifice. And this neighbor is just completely at wit's end. He says, what kind of religion is this? And that's just it. She says, Jesus is the beginning point and the ending point for us. As we think about how we approach God, as we think about these good gifts that God has given us and that we use to come before his presence and to be shaped by him, the point is not in the gifts, but only that they point us to the giver, that they shape us like Jesus, that they help us focus our minds and our hearts on Jesus. And so I pray this morning as we talk about Sabbath, something that can feel so foreign, so different for so many of us, I pray that we see that the point is so relevant to us, that Jesus is at the center of our faith. Jesus is the beginning and the end. He's the place where we find the rest that we were made for, the peace that we were made for, the hope that we were made for. Because Jesus is the one who took to that Roman cross and who died in our place and for our sins. And when he said, it is finished, we step into that rest and that peace that he has provided.